So we are going to have our first keynote speech of the afternoon. And first for the introduction, I'm calling Fiona.
Okay, welcome everybody again. It's a pleasure to have this introductory task. I'm going to introduce our keynote speaker from the United States, Michael Kades. He is a Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the U.S. DOJ. He works in the Antitrust Division, and his focus is civil enforcement. Prior to being at DOJ, Michael spent 20 years investigating and litigating in the competition enforcement area at the FTC. And in addition to those qualifications, Michael is also an old and good friend of mine. We worked together on competition policy since about 2015, I think, in the United States, when Michael was detailed to work for Senator Klobuchar. Amy Klobuchar is one of our senators in the United States with a deep interest in competition enforcement. And Michael then went to the Center for Equitable Growth in Washington. So really, for many decades, he has been a champion of competition enforcement, both being progressive and skilled. Those two things don't always go together, so we appreciate when they do. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome Michael to the stage. Thank you.
As Fiona said that, I realized my computer is on a low battery, so this could be a really short speech. Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me. I am going to give a non-traditional disclosure. I've spent exactly 6 nights at home since October 31st. So if I start talking about fat cattle or feed cattle or backgrounders, or start complaining about airlines or talking about the lack of entry, well, you know, that was just the wrong speech came up on the screen. So given the panels you guys have had, and really the expertise level of the folks here in the audience, I'm a little afraid that what you hear from me for the next 20 minutes will seem a little obvious and devoid of humor. But in some sense, the obvious is the point here. As an antitrust enforcer for most of my career, there's a lot of frustration. Too often, the government has to litigate cases that should be obvious, or as I like to say it, a government enforcer's job is all too often having to prove that water makes things wet. Now, there are many explanations for this challenge. Outcomes in litigation just are inherently quite random. The law in the US is not strong enough. The courts are too conservative. Defense bar attorneys are better in the courtroom. The government is too theoretical in trial. The government's not theoretical enough in trial. We need less economics, and we need more economics in trial. Answer is yes. So that was your joke. So if you didn't laugh, don't blame me. But the reality is there is no single solution. But I want to focus on one specific area and how that solution can help. So if antitrust fights gave scars, I would have a deep one from the fight over hospital merger enforcement in the United States. Because beginning in the 1980s, the government lost 9 merger challenges, virtually all of which were like 3-2 or 2-1. You can go read them to be perplexed. Now, eventually, through a lot of hard work, the FTC did manage to turn that around. They have since won, I think, 8 out of 9. But the damage done in that decade will not be restored. And it continues to be a hospital merger challenge, continues to be an incredibly expensive, difficult, and complicated undertaking, despite the fact that there are slews of studies at this point showing that almost certainly hospital concentration amongst horizontal competitors increases prices, and maybe we can't certainly say it decreases quality, but we can say it doesn't increase quality. And yet these continue to be make or break cases. A second scar would be from my fight over pay for delay patent settlements. After a 10-year battle with a series of losses, the Federal Trade Commission convinced the Supreme Court by a single vote the very controversial idea that a company with substantial market power paying a potential competitor not to enter the market could be anti-competitive. 10 years to get that. So when Mike Davis was talking about how the problems in pharma, I'm like, welcome to my club. Now, in both these examples, the economics was clear, right? So one challenge in antitrust law is that how it is practiced, it often clings to principles, economic or policy, long after they have lost currency. And if we analogize courts to a policy-making body, that problem's not unique. In many areas in policy-making, principles accepted currently by policymakers turn out to have actually been rejected by the people who actually are experts. So economic propositions that were once taken as articles of faith just a few decades ago now are often resemble discarded theories refuted by research. The impact of minimum wage, the inherent tension between addressing growth and inequality. That revelation is occurring in antitrust policy as well, but not exclusively by academic research. That research, though, is driving changes in enforcement. Good, and that is the critical word here, good economic analysis is and will continue to be critical for effective antitrust enforcement. Now, it should be obvious, right, that good research works its way into policy, but it turns out to be actually somewhat uncommon. And as basic as it is, it's worth reviewing where and how economic research is affecting antitrust enforcement. So I want to set the context here a little broader before I go into a detailed analysis of the hypothetical monopoly test. No. If we go back to the 1990s and the 2000s, they were kind of a heady time, right? Democracy had triumphed over communism. The big tech boom seemed to prove yet again the vitality of Western-style capitalism. Even in economic policy, there was somewhat of a broad agreement, right? The Clintonomics seemed to say you could address conservative concerns about inefficiency in government, but still address social policy. And at that time, there was I think antitrust kind of had this similar moment of triumphalism. Law schools, treatises, people in the bar celebrated that there was this purported consensus. And it was sort of a mixture of the Chicago school and the post-Chicago school ideas. There were debates to be had, but they were on the margins, and they were technical. And I have to say, as a young attorney, and maybe it's because I had hair then, I probably would have agreed with that assessment in the 1990s. But whatever that consensus was, and however real it was, it had shattered by 2015. Instead, a broad public debate erupted. And no longer was antitrust enforcement a backwater involving small groups of experts. Members of Congress began giving speeches and even writing books about antitrust. The Economist and Time magazine are publishing stories on the threat of monopoly. Congress actually investigated tech companies, wildly divergent public figures. Hopefully both these guys know about them, I think so, from John Oliver to Tucker Carlson, we're concerned about the state of competition. So, but before I go back to antitrust, I want to once again, pull the aperture out a bit and talk about broader issues, right? So, and I want to start with the minimum wage briefly. Right, so back in 1946, George Stigler asserted confidently that the potential for minimum wage harm to worker was, quote, unusually definite for questions of policy. That assumption largely remained unchallenged for decades. Then in 1994, David Carr and Alan Kruger published an article, doing like actual empirical work, and they found that New Jersey had increased its minimum wage by 80 cents and Pennsylvania hadn't, and they found no evidence that that increase dampened employment in the fast food industry. In fact, relative employment in the fast food industry actually increased in New Jersey. In the last 30 years, I think there are now few economists who would contend unequivocally that raising the minimum wage is always bad. To the contrary, in a recent review of economic literature, Alan Manning explained that the effect of the minimum wage is so muted that minimum wage raises wages more than it has any effect on jobs. We turn to a second area, economic growth. Right, back in the 70s, Professor Arthur Oken described redistribution programs as, quote, a leaky bucket, quote, sort of asking the question how much loss of water, i.e. economic productivity, society was willing to tolerate to reduce inequality and poverty. That question haunted social programs for decades. Yet new evidence suggests that the trade-off is far more complicated. As a 2014 OECD report concluded, income inequality has a negative and statistically significant impact on medium-term growth. So in some sense, it would be really shocking that if those ideas that were so central to policy making in the late 20th century were discarded, limited, and even discarded, but the antitrust principles embedded in how the courts thought about competition would remain unscathed. And indeed, many of the principles that have carried and continue to carry weight with those who practice antitrust law or the judges who decide no longer should be accepted. So today I want to look at 3 examples, identify the research, and how that enforcement is changing. Proposition number 1, cartels are inherently unstable and self-correcting. The leader of the Chicago School, Robert Bork, contended that, quote, changing market conditions and the temptation to cheat frequently result in outbreaks of price competition that either destroy the cartel or must be repaired by further meetings and agreements. This fragility, Bork posited, made cartels, quote, easy to detect, quote, and tacit agreements unlikely. In his view, quote, if uncertainties and temptations break down, even detailed and specific agreements on prices, what chance has unspoken, detailed mutual restraint of surviving market pressures? The best guess, he concluded, none. That guess grew into a virtually indisputable premise. Now, even during this precept's heyday, some scholars questioned whether cartels were really that unstable and competition that certain. Subsequent scholarship by Margaret C. Levenstein and Valerie Suslow, among others, found cartels have considerable longevity. Some cartels lasted decades, and often only government enforcement terminated the conduct, not cheating, not entry. So now 2 recent cases that we have brought, I think, emphasize the implementation of that insight. The division has settled a case with 4 poultry processors over allegations that they collaborated, including during in-person resort trips with their competitors in making decisions about worker compensation. They did this for over 20 years. Second, also in the meat processing industry, the division brought an information sharing case, alleging that the defendant has orchestrated for decades information exchanges among virtually all major chicken, pork, and turkey processors to exchange highly granular information related to price, output, cost, and other sensitive aspects. The division alleges that conduct began decades ago. That case is still ongoing. Both of those cases obviously involve very long-lasting cartels. Proposition number 2. As with traditional cartels, Bork asserted confidently, quote, that we are entitled to be Proposition 2, I didn't read that. Merger analysis should de-emphasize concerns about coordinated effects. Sorry about that. Bork asserted confidently, quote, that we are entitled to be highly skeptical of the entire theory of oligopolistic interdependence, and that he was, quote, not persuaded that such behavior occurs outside of economics. That critique, coupled with the broader attack on the value of structural evidence in merger reform, drove the focus to unilateral effects. Now, not to be misunderstood, I'm certainly not a critic of unilateral effects cases. I think they're really important, and the adoption by the courts was an important victory, one that we owe a lot of thanks to in the United States, the enforcers during the Obama administration. But it just shouldn't be an either-or situation. Again, what we see is recent empirical work has confirmed that increasing market concentration can result in oligopoly price leadership. For example, one study found that after the Miller-Coors merger in 2008, the two beer giants, ABI and Miller, started pursuing oligopolistic pricing. And every year one would publicize prices to take effect in the future, a couple months, and then the other would follow. Ultimately, using the very best econometric techniques, the authors estimated that the price leader prices after the merger were about 9% higher than they otherwise would have been. Similarly, a literature review of mergers in oligopolistic markets, which mostly examined airlines, banking, hospital, and petroleum, concluded that, quote, the empirical evidence that mergers can cause economically significant increases in prices is overwhelming. In fact, they found that in 36 of the 49 mergers they studied. And we are beginning to see the impact of this work. In the United States versus Bertelsmann, Judge Pan found that the merger there amongst the book publishers would raise the likelihood of tacit collusion. And she relied, among other things, on the actual history of collusion in the industry. Our most recent proposed merger guidelines incorporate recent learning and provide more direct explanation for what we'd be looking for in a coordinated effects case. A third area where economic realities have overtaken antitrust dogma is in labor. For a long time, antitrust enforcers discounted the likelihood that workers or suppliers could be victims of anti-competitive conduct of mergers. One argument was that, well, labor markets are always incredibly competitive. And then others also said, look, why is monopsony so bad? If the buyer prices goes down, they'll just be able to sell it at a lower price to the consumer. And then, somewhat relatedly, over the last 40 years, courts, maybe relying on those sorts of thoughts, have been very sympathetic to non-compete agreements. As one prominent judge explained, in advocating for enforcement of such covenants, he said, quote, an adult of sound mind who made an unequivocal promise for which he was doubtlessly adequately compensated should be bound by that. And that if covenants not to compete are forbidden, the employer will pay a lower wage, in effect charging the employee for the training. All those assumptions, highly competitive markets, benefits to consumers, non-competes are a fair bargain, and employees are adequately compensated, all suggest that labor markets are relatively free of anti-competitive concerns. Won't surprise you at this point, turns out they're all pretty much wrong, those assumptions. Recent literature review by Professor Alan Manning found market power amongst employers turns out to be pretty common. Quote, all of these studies, including those with high quality research designs, show that firms have considerable monopsony power, even in online markets that a priori one might have thought they would be competitive. Another study by Elena Prager and Matt Schmidt concluded that the mergers dampened wages for specialized healthcare workers. Nor has the theoretical support for monopsony power held up. Point you to the article by Scott Hemphill and Nancy Rose pointing out that, in fact, monopsony power either has no effect in the downstream market or it makes it worse. And the research on non-competes is even more substantial, finding that they apply to low-wage workers, which doesn't make a lot of sense, that they actually empirically seem to reduce wages, not increase them. And so consistent with that literature, the division has been active in addressing anti-competitive conduct affecting workers and suppliers. In addition to the Random House case, which was a monopsony case, and one of the chicken cases involved wage compensation agreements that affect workers. Last month, the Antitrust Division brought its first enforcement action challenging a de facto non-compete, where the case involved the workers subject to the non-compete were contract farmers. They grew chickens, not highly skilled workers. They received absolutely nothing for signing a contract that forced them to pay a penalty if they switched to one of the processor's competitors, and that this had the real and actual effect of stifling competition among processors and depriving those growers of the benefits of competition. So if you've listened to probably about the last half of the speech, I guess many of you are saying, well, that's all obvious. This isn't like complicated, like high tech or networks or multi-markets. And that is exactly the point. Effective antitrust enforcement requires expunging ideas like those that I've been discussing are valid. Courts need to learn not to rely on what is no longer accepted truth. Otherwise, we can't hope to tackle the more complicated problems. So I will now return you to your regular scheduled program on cutting-edge legal issues, and thank you for your time.